This, yes, all good. All is good. Thank you, Sue.
Just so you can check everything again one last time.
Okay, hi.
Okay, we're going live.
Okay,
Okay, so this is what we're going with.
this is where we're gonna start. Okay.
Okay, I'm just rather
mithandazo yethu Nkosi sikelela thina lusapho lwayo lulela buluka sitshaba sa Yesu ufeliseni mthwali mazwele usibuluke sitshaba sa Yesu sitshaba sa South Africa South Africa Eti
Dumelang, Sanibonani, bonjour, siku njema, greetings ladies and gentlemen, and all our distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us for our 11th Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture. The lecture is hosted by the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs and is a joint initiative of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Puleng Sekgalo. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of South Africa and also hold the position of the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair. It is my absolute honor to be steering today's program. In his speech made in 2013, President Paul Kagame reminds us that Africa's story has been written by others and that we need to own our own problems and solutions and write our story. As we look back and reflect on what many of the African leaders lamented on, we need to pause and think about how much of what they said continue to ring true today. Africa continues to face numerous challenges. The past year has been exceptionally complex, with us having to confront the COVID pandemic. Some of the issues that we need to pause and think about include the difficulty of finding peace and stability in South Sudan, the 2020 Ivory Coast presidential elections and what has been called third termism, and the postponement of Somalia elections, challenges of peace in the Horn of Africa, and the role of the African Union and all that has been happening in Africa. With these brief remarks, I would now like to invite the Principal and Vice Chancellor of UNISA, Professor Puleng Lenkabula, to do the opening and officially welcome us. Professor Puleng.
Thank you. Program Director, Professor Puleng Sekgalo, Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair and Associate Professor in Psychology at the University of South Africa, His Excellency President Dr. Thabo Mbeki, former President of the Republic of South Africa, patron of the Thabo Mbeki School, as well as the University of South Africa Chancellor, and Mrs. Zanele Mbeki. Mr. Busani Ngaweni, Deputy Chairperson of University Council and UNISA Council members present. Professor Funmi Oloni Sakin, Vice President and Vice Principal International and Professor of Security Leadership and Development at King's College London, UK, and our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, Minister of Home Affairs, Mr. Kodidiza, Minister of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform, Mr. Fikile Mbalula, Minister of Transport, Mr. Mamuluko Kubai Ngubani, Minister of Tourism, Ms. Kumbuzo Nchaveni, Minister of Small Business Development, Mr. Buti Manamela, Deputy Minister of Higher Education and Training, Advocate Patekile Holomisa, Deputy Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Mr. Zizi Kodwa, Deputy Minister of State Security, Mr. Fish Masalela, Deputy Minister of Tourism, Mrs. Sakani Maluleke, Auditor General, Dr. Brigalia Bam, Chairperson of Thabo Mbeki Foundation and Board, Board present, Professor Bani Pitiana, Advisory Council member at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and former Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Professor Sibusiso Vil Ngomo, Executive Dean of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at UNISA, Professor Mandla Makanya, former Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, and other former members of UNISA management, members of UNISA management present, Your Excellencies, ambassadors and high commissioners representing various countries present, members of the national, provincial and local government present, representative of the Council on Higher Education and Universities in South Africa, representatives from various higher education institutions, local and international present, former members of UNISA Council present, members of the business community, Chancellor's Club, civil society, various political parties present, Archbishop Thabo Makhuba and all ecclesiastical communities, international organizations, recipients of honorary doctoral degrees of UNISA present, members of UNISA National Student Representative Council and other student structures, representatives from various media fraternal, representatives of various structures and stakeholders of the University of South Africa, UNISA retirees, alumni, and other staff members present, distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen, Dumelang, Sanibonani. The commemoration of Africa Day was meant to provide African leaders with reflective pause to examine the progress that Africa has made since independence and to further faced by African countries. When UNISA first held its important and memorable day in our history as a continent on 25th May 2010, the Africa Day, the day that was first commemorated on 25th May 1963. The inaugural lecture was then delivered by His Excellency former President Mbeki of South Africa, the patron of the foundation, but also the Chancellor. The theme of his engagement indeed was a fitting one. It was titled, Can Africa Claim the 21st Century? Today, more than a decade since the inauguration of the first Africa Day at UNISA, and in collaboration with the TM School, we can still ask the same question, and informed by the theme of 2021, we may want to ask the kind of Africa we want. At this time of the year, Africans and those who love this continent and its people gather to celebrate what it means to being African, to stretch what it means to being African, to jettison those things that limit possibility, and to reflect on the meaning of freedom. so much of which was won through great struggle. Africa Day gives all of us a chance to pause and to consider connections between the hopes of the past and the disappointments of the present. The struggles continue to this day because freedom is both beautiful and elusive. I've been inspired by the writings of young women of African descent whose works add to the rich tapestry of voices that create new worlds from which we can reimagine our societies. As Africa Month draws to a close, I would want to share these voices, for theirs are voices that bring to us a progressive vision and remind us why women creators also matter as we celebrate Africa Day. These younger, newer writers do not replace the older writers whose works captured the imagination of earlier generations. Their work centers of African experiences in ways that were simply impossible for earlier writers who had not had to contend with the dominance of the colonial view. But both sets of writers remind us that the personal, the political, and the imaginative will always be inextricably tied. One of the things that emerged from considering the power of these new literary voices is that complexity is at the core of much of our exploration of identity, aspiration, and storytelling are about. It is Yaa Gyasi, author of Homegoing and Transcendent Kingdom, who reminds us in her reflections on writing history. We believe the one who has the power, she or he is the one who gets to write the story. So when you study history, you must always ask yourself, whose story am I missing? Whose voice was suppressed so that this voice could come forth? Once you have figured that out, you must find that story too. From there, you must begin to get a cleaner and clearer, yet simply imperfect picture. Literature gives us a way by which women's lives, but also their communities, can be showcased and reimagined outside the limiting construct of patriarchy and the tradition. Maza Mengistu of Ethiopia, a writer of dazzling talent, is the author of novels Beneath the Lion's Gaze and The Shadow King. In The Shadow King, Mengistu forces us to pay attention to those who have been relegated to the margins of histories and history. The women warriors whose voices, contribution have been rendered invisible in the silent are brought to the fore. In this way, she asks us to consider, in the many stories of liberation across the continent, the women have been sidelined, forgotten, and the heroes brought to the fore are mostly men. But we know this is not true fully, and whether it is in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, women rose against colonial authorities, and they rose too against the post-colonial governments when they ceased to focus on the political economic liberation. And they continue to lend their voice to the cause of the new freedoms for which new generations yearn. She can hear the dead growing louder. We must be heard. We must be remembered. We must be known. We will not rest until we have been mourned. She opens the box. For me, it was a symbolic, the way that all have a responsibility to reclaim the dead, the living, to remember them and to speak of them in such ways that we understand the kind of future that we are working towards, that they were fighting for. Mengistu adds powerfully, the path towards freedom is never a simple one. Where others may simply yearn for political freedom, they soon learn that freedom are linked and freedom must be imagined in the widest, most expansive version. Naledi Mashishi, the young South African writer, brings a story that dares to explore the world of false prophets. Her novel, The Invisible String, smells both the past and the present, the living and the dead, and the apartheid South Africa and the present day South Africa collide in ways that show that the past is always with us, and it profoundly affects how we negotiate our ways to the imagined future. I was struck by the similarity between the charismatic false prophets and the ways they prey on their communities, and the way popular, deeply charismatic politicians have also, to some extent, sold their communities so much false hope. There's something eerily powerful about the title of the novel because it is the invisible strings that tie the lives of the desperately poor in the township, the offensively affluent in their secluded areas. Those who have grabbed the lion's share of the spoils of freedom hide their greed behind the veil of smooth-sounding slogans that grow emptier by the day. Bolu brings us the stories of love, but she does so much more than that. She shows us that love is one of the most complex human emotions. In her collection of short stories, she explores a world that stretches from North Africa to Southern Tip. Many of the stories she tells are about marginalized women, those whose lives are tucked away at the edge of society. Babaola enters their own idea of what it means to love, to be seen. She also asks us to consider whose myths are worth holding onto, telling and retelling. Her book, Love in Color, is a collection of 13 stories, most of them engaged in the art of retelling. From Lesotho's Naledi to Greece, Psyche, and Eros, these stories show that love has always been one's personal, but always in some way. I want to, therefore, what we know is so Western and white, and these stories, I'm encountering women of color, mostly black women, and exploring stories that aren't just about struggle and pain, but of joy, love, and connection. As I said earlier, the generation of younger scholars in many ways have picked up the baton from their literary forebears, and the whispers of Toni Morrison, Stan's Alice Walker, Miriam Tladi, Miriam Ba, Bessie Head, Nina Simone, of Miriam Makeba, of Buchi Emecheta, Nikki Giovanni, and many others. But there's also interconnectedness with the works of feminists beyond the diaspora, the voices of Susan Sontag, of Joni Mitchell, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich in her poem, Diving into the Wreck. Adrienne Rich writes, I'm here, the mermaid whose dark hair streams black, the mermaid in the armored body. We circle silently about the wreck. We dive into the hold. We are, I am, you are, by cowardice of courage, the one who finds our way back into the scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book, a myth, in which our names do not appear. First published in 1973, this poem concerned with the absence of names of women from books of myth. Nearly half a century later, a new generation of writers is writing the literary body, the lives of stories of women. And as we celebrate Africa Month and toast each other Africa Day, we should take time to read and reread the stories at the center of women's experience that dare to imagine storytelling can provide a spark for a change of social institution. The words of Adrienne Rich capture this eloquently. Poetry is not a healing lotion, an emotional massage, a kind of linguistic aromatherapy, but it is to address the challenges that society encounter. Those who dare rise up against what they see as injustice, what they experience as stifling of their freedom, as betrayal of their hopes and dashing of their deepest yearning, often take to song, to the pen, to give us a glimpse of the world in which freedom reigns. These storytellers do not merely contend with the limitations of the structures that restrict the lives of women, they explode them. They render their lives visible in the ways that remind us that Africans have richly layered lives, and it is this richness that we have to celebrate today. It is unfortunate that we deal with COVID-19 as Africans who have many similar experiences to draw from. The African continent has dealt with multiple epidemics, many of which we have to overcome. The obstacles to treatment and care for COVID-19 are proving to be multiple. People live in close quarters, making physical distancing impossible. The everyday economies of many individuals in our continent do not allow hard lockdowns, as it has been shown in South Africa. Vaccinations are slow and non-existent in some countries. The obstacles seem to be many, but the resilience and the positive aspects seem to be galore. These solutions could include enhancement of welfare provisions where those already in existence, and to start providing such services where they are not already. El Sadar Jasmine rightfully wants that epidemics know no borders, and success in controlling the epidemic in one country will be limited to another country. If we are to make progress in building our continent, it is the people, our reflections on this day, that should also acknowledge the continuing unfavorable conditions, but also the continuing displacement of people from conflict-ridden societies, including questions on economic migrations, the high levels of violence, especially gender-based violence, meted out on women and lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual persons continue. Inequality with negative impacts on economic and ecological outcomes is becoming a reality. Africa Day within UNISA context is important and remains important for us. Thank you very much. I wish to welcome you all as we promote and proclaim Africa Day. We understand the role that UNISA plays in providing the opportunity to reflect around reclaiming Africa's intellectual traditions, reclaiming the future, propelling society through knowledge, but also collaborating with the TM School in order that we promote Africa Day. With these words, we would like to welcome you all and wish you all the best Africa Day that it has to offer, and encourage us to be witnesses into the struggles for human dignity and the recognition for continuing as we grapple with the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Chancellor. Thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for the reminder of the work that still needs to be done. But most importantly, thank you for centering African scholars, for centering African writers, in particular women writers, whose words continue to be marginalized, and you centering them today plays a very critical role. Thank you very much. And as the Vice Chancellor has welcomed us, I would like now to provide an opportunity now for us to have a short intro video.
Africa, our continent, faces many challenges. Challenge to fight and defeat poverty and underdevelopment. The challenge is to fight conflict and war in order to establish peace. The challenge is to overcome preventable diseases and provide health for all. The challenge is to address matters of cooperation, integration, unity among all of us as Africans. The challenge is to master the sciences, to make sure that as Africans we are part of the fourth industrial revolution. Challenges of managing diverse societies, therefore to live up to such concepts as unity in diversity. Challenges of governance, of making sure that we govern ourselves in a manner that respects the principle that the people shall govern. We govern ourselves in such a way that indeed we overcome the challenges that I've spoken of. It's exactly in this context, in that context, that the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa, UNISA, got together and agreed and decided that there must be established this Thabo Mbeki African School for Public and International Affairs. Because in the view of the university and indeed of the foundation, our belief is that the intelligentsia is a very important asset for our continent in terms of addressing the challenges I've spoken of. And therefore, here we have now this school. It is being staffed with some of the best brains on our continent, even from the diaspora, focused especially on these particular challenges to produce the people, the intellectual cadres, the intellectual combatants who are going to be able to help to empower our continent to be able to respond positively to these challenges. It's a project on which I think all of us as Africans should be very proud, because it's not just a center of learning for the sake of learning, but it's a center of learning, of research, of being able to produce the knowledge, the ways and the means, the understanding, which will make our continent to achieve its renaissance.
The TM School is committed to reclaiming Africa's intellectual futures, accelerating transformation in the face and aftermath of COVID-19, and as well ensuring that UNISA advances African intellectual knowledge systems and does not only or is not only limited to thinking about publishing as conduits, but also through the invention of structures, systems, products, and processes which advance human flourishing, dignity, and ecological sustainability, whilst attentive to the fourth industrial revolution and its demand.
The name Thabo Mbeki conjured upon a devotion to the African Renaissance and a desire to grow a new breed of Africa critical and intellectual leadership that would become the engine for transforming the African socio-political landscape, such as to nurture the African mind to achieve the true task of freedom that the founding fathers and mothers of the Pan-Africanist movement yearned for. The partnership was formalized by a memorandum of agreement in 2010, and that immediately led to the establishment of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. It also brought into UNISA a number of initiatives started by President Mbeki while he was to advance the key elements of his ideas and philosophy about Africa, peace and development. These included SADC, IGD, the Africa Day and Women's Day lectures, which constituted the intellectual project of the Mbeki years.
The Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs is a magnet of excellence. The vision is to create an African global and futuristic school of public and international affairs, with a mission to become a beacon of excellence in balancing theory and practice in knowledge production utilization through a transdisciplinary approach. Develop and educate leaders that solve complex problems in Africa and beyond. This requires a collaborative, innovative environment where respect, care for human beings, and excellence are grounded on core values.
The school will offer both formal and non-formal programs, which will include a master and a PhD in public and international affairs, short learning programs, and customized executive level training workshops. Our curriculum and scholarship is designed to affirm Africa as a legitimate site of ideation, innovation, and knowledge production. It is therefore undergirded by African philosophies, epistemologies, and methodologies. Through its formal postgraduate program, we want to develop and train students in high-level transdisciplinary research in public and international affairs. We want to educate and train students to contribute to the development of knowledge at an advanced level. Our students should be able to think critically, analyze and solve policy problems in order to become impactful leaders for the public good. We aim to produce well-rounded, sophisticated, ethical and resilient graduates who can function in complex environments. This will be led by a world-renowned faculty that is agile, research active, technologically savvy, and futuristic in thinking. The complexities of the 21st century requires that we also produce high-quality research that is impactful and at the cutting edge of scholarship to help us solve the problems on the continent and beyond.
And now we would like to welcome Premier of Gauteng, Mr. David Makura, who's just joined us online. Welcome, Mr. Makura. And ladies and gentlemen, I would also just like to remind you that as you listen, you also have the opportunity to pose your questions on the chat box. And so we invite you to please make sure that you pose those questions on the chat box. Now, the Thabo Mbeki School has a number of strategic projects, and one of them is the South African Democracy Education Trust, SADET. SADET was established as a project trust after President Thabo Mbeki indicated his concern about the paucity of historical material on the difficult and complex road to South Africa's peaceful political settlement after decades of violent conflict. It is a heritage project that aims at providing a major study of South Africa's political history between 1960 and 1994, and thereby revealing the hidden aspects of this history, enabling key individuals as well as ordinary citizens to tell the story of their role in the liberation struggle, and by placing these stories in the public domain. And now we shall have a short video of the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs. The video later. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite the Executive Dean of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, Professor Sibusiso Nkomo, to provide us with an overview of the Thabo Mbeki School and to introduce our guest speaker. Over to you, Prof. Nkomo.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. The School of Public and International Affairs, as I stated earlier on in the video, is a magnet of excellence. It is a school which is intended to achieve the objectives that will lead to Africa's advancement and development. With these short words...
Oh, it was the one that came before.
Are we still on?
Carry on, Prof.
Okay, yes. Yes, and now I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker. It is with pride that I introduce our distinguished lecturer, a scholar of repute, Professor Phumni Olonisikin is Vice President and Vice Principal International and Professor of Security, Leadership and Development. She founded the African Leadership Center, which aims to build the next generation of African scholars and analysts, generating cutting-edge knowledge, peace, security, and development in Africa. She was director of the Conflict Security and Development Group at King's College London from 2003 to 2013. Prior to this, she worked in the office of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. Professor Olonisikin has positioned her work to serve as a bridge between academia and the worlds of policy and practice. Her most recent research has focused on reframing narratives of peace and state building in Africa, and on future peace, society and the state in Africa. In January 2020, Professor Olonisikin was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as one of the 7 members of the advisory group of experts on the review of the UN peace-building architecture. She was appointed in 2016 as a member of the advisory group of experts for the UN Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security. She serves on the board of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and chairs the African Regional Advisory Committee of the Open Society Foundation. She has been honored by being appointed as Professor Extraordinaire at the University of Pretoria, the Department of Political Science. She was also appointed to be the to be appointed to the Council of the United Nations University. She is chairperson of the Board of Advisors of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, where she serves with distinguished scholars and professors. We look forward to your continuous seminar lectures at the school and think tanking sessions at the school. Professor Olonisikin, the podium is now yours.
Thank you so very much, Professor Vilunkomo. Thank you. Program Director, Professor Puleng Segalo, Chancellor of the University of South Africa, His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki, Principal and Vice Chancellor of UNISA, Professor Puleng Lekambula, and again, Executive Dean of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, Professor Sibosiso Vilunkomo, distinguished guests, colleagues, all daughters and sons of Africa watching and listening today, I send you warm greetings. I wish to begin on a note of remembrance, remembering those who left us on Africa Day in years past, and not least during this pandemic year. I especially remember today Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, a brother, friend, and great Pan-African who left us under such tragic circumstances 12 years ago today, on his way to Kigali to celebrate Africa Day. To echo the text, or at least part of it, of the text of the 1999 Algiers Declaration, I bow to the memory of all the martyrs of Africa, whose supreme sacrifice has paved the way for the continent to regain its freedom and dignity. I pay tribute today to the sons and daughters of our continent who laid down their lives for its political and economic emancipation, and for the restoration of its dignity, of its identity and civilization under conditions of extreme adversity. As we mark this year's Africa Day, amid a fight against a pandemic and against the backdrop of African unions silencing the gun agenda, the evidence today suggests that the guns are far from being silent. From Mozambique to Tigray and Chad, the guns continue to blaze amid snippets of lighter developments. The time has come for some honest stock-taking. And in doing so, the theme highlighted in the announcement of this lecture, retrospecting to prospect, Quo Vadis Africa. Where is Africa headed? That theme is indeed apt. It is this that led me to frame a central question for this lecture. In looking back to look forward, and to ask where Africa may be heading, it is important to ask this question: what will sustain Africa's peace? One might ask, does Africa have peace? Therefore, what do I mean by Africa's peace? To be sure, Africa is not without its measure of peace. The vast majority of African citizens are peaceful whilst aspiring to live well, to live long, and in dignity. So contrary to what is often claimed, the majority of Africa's young people of an average age of 19 and a half years are peaceful. Only a tiny proportion is involved in violence. And that was reflected in the report of the Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security a few years back. We knew that even before then. In the main, the people of our continent are peace-loving. But more significantly, I speak of Africa's peace because Africa has a peace agenda, a blueprint for peace, which consists of the things we said we would do to sustain peace nearly a generation ago. Africa has well-developed norms, supported by a well-defined peace and security architecture, as well as an integration agenda. I still recall how the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, caught the imagination of many of my colleagues at the United Nations in New York in 2001. And of course, the same thing when the African Union's Constitutive Act broke new ground because of Article 4H, which I'll mention in a short while. It is therefore really sobering for me to convey my key message at the start of this lecture. And it is that Africa's peace agenda is profoundly insecure as a result of deep flaws in its leadership infrastructure. The peace agenda is in crisis today. The transition from non-intervention to non-indifference, which was at the height of the AU Constitutive Act, something to behold, which characterized the move from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. This may be dead. There's a dire shortage of the quality of leadership that would secure and develop Africa. Had we proceeded on the trajectory that was planned, we might have managed to secure African peoples to a great extent and moved significantly in the direction of silencing the guns. Nationally and internationally, the weakness of leadership and the non-rootedness of national leaders and their disconnection from citizens, all of this has severely weakened the institution at all levels. So with this message in mind, I would like to make 5 interrelated arguments. All these strands are interconnected, and I hope you bear with me as I try to tease this out step by step. First, Africa is not short of sound norms. Many of these norms remain relevant for today's conditions. As such, we do not need new norms, but I must say that the existing norms are under attack and they face contestation from a number of sources. Second, many of the situations for which these norms were developed remain unaddressed, and in some cases, we are seeing a reversal of the very norms, the very ideas that we designed, and we're seeing this reversal as a result of leadership action or inaction. Third, the institutional architecture that supports Africa's blueprint for peace is not only underpinned by an appropriate leadership software deficit, if you like, and I will describe this later, leadership software, please bear that in mind. It is also severely challenged by new threats, which might render the African peace and security architecture unfit for purpose. Overall, this architecture is not only facing a problem of implementation and poor leadership in that respect, it is also not dynamic in response to new threats. Fourth, Africa is fast becoming a site in which external vultures of both state and non-state extraction, in which these vultures feast, sometimes cloaked in the image of the Messiah coming to rescue Africa from the scourge of terror. And new and old actors alike add to this complexity. Fifth and last, for Africa's peace to be secure, it must stand on 3 equal and interconnected pillars in a relationship that places people at the center of the nation and supranational project for the realization of Africa's peace and development. One phrase I will use a number of times throughout this lecture is that of the leadership infrastructure. I've used this several times already, and I think it is important to say what I mean by this. Leadership infrastructure has two components: the hardware and the software. What is the hardware? The hardware is the tangible aspect of that infrastructure, which of course, it's what we all see at the heart of governance and not the software. It includes the buildings, the laws that confer power to institutions and to the personnel who run those institutions. It symbolizes the existence of those institutions, at least in the first instance. While these symbols can exercise powerful influence because they project an image of power and possibly sophistication, it is the way that they exercise power conferred on them that determines their continued relevance. And this is the software element of the leadership infrastructure, which is perhaps more important than the hardware. It includes the way that power is organized and exercised, as well as the kind of relationships that it builds with the broader society over time. Outside of the formal realm, that software is also about the shared expectations and interests that form those relationships across society at all levels. Uncovering the nature of the software of the leadership infrastructure requires an understanding of the leadership process. A process-based approach to leadership therefore focuses on how leaders and the communities they serve exchange influence within a given context. And we attempted to do this across the continent a generation ago. That interaction, as one of my students, and I'm grateful for this co-creation, Lingana Den Mode, my PhD student from Mauritius, says it is the lifeblood of leadership. And so we need to sit back and see what our leadership infrastructure has looked like. Over-reliance on the hardware elements of this leadership infrastructure at the expense of the software has rendered governance at national, regional, and global levels unfit for purpose when confronted by challenges such as political insecurity, complete insecurity on the military front, or health crisis, as we have seen with COVID-19. The crucially important software dimensions of leadership must be refitted to the leadership infrastructure at all levels. And I want to suggest that at some point, almost a generation ago now, that this is what we started doing at the level of the African Union, trying to connect the Union at the continental level with the peoples of Africa in very creative ways, especially when at the national level, all that people relied upon for leadership was the hardware itself. There was hardly any relationship in some contexts between those managers of the hardware and the rest of the population. So let's look at the evidence. If we did what we said we would do, why are things so wrong today? Let's look at some of the evidence supporting the interrelated arguments. We've talked about Africa's sound normative framework for conflict prevention. We have seen the adoption of important instruments to address the root causes of conflict and to promote conflict prevention. And we have seen the important evidence of what African leaders committed to as part of the transition from the OAU to the African Union. And I only mention some of this in headline form: the condemnation and rejection of unconstitutional change of government. And we have seen what we desired in terms of democratic transitions in the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the establishment of an African Court of Human and People's Rights, the African Charter on Elections and Democracy and Good Governance and the Guidelines for African Union Electoral Observation and Monitoring of Elections, and so on. The Solemn Declaration on Gender Equality in Africa, and actually also the protocol to the African Charter on Human Rights, on the rights of women in particular. I mean, these are markers of progress, to be sure. But much of this was embedded in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which excited all of us at the time as young scholars, as young African scholars in different parts of the world who studied with excitement the new African Union as the work began. And I think it's worth highlighting aspects of the Constitutive Act in headline form as well. The Act is clear in Article 4 about the participation of African peoples in the activities of the Union, in the prohibition of the use of force or threat of force among member states. But very interestingly, in 4H, the right of the Union to intervene in a member state pursuant to the decision of the Assembly in respect of grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. And of course, it embeds within it all of what I said earlier, including the condemnation and rejection of unconstitutional changes of governments. It provides for a Pan-African Parliament to ensure the full participation of African peoples in the development and economic integration of the continent. In short, a forward-looking constitutive act which placed the people of Africa at the center of it and their protection at all costs, even when leaders of their states make it impossible for them to live in dignity. This excited the whole world. And this is what that excitement in New York, in different power centers globally, was all about. We then subsequently, almost immediately after the establishment of the Union, the work began for the establishment of the Peace and Security Council and, of course, the African Peace and Security Architecture and the rigorous pursuit of its implementation. Some of us were lucky to have been part of that conversation. And therefore, all of what we already know about the Commission, the Panel of the Wise, the Continental Early Warning System, the African Standby Force, and the Special Fund were the heartbeat of this peace architecture. So why are we where we are? Right from the start, we began to see some of the telltale signs. Several strategic plans were developed, among them the Institutional Transformation Program, ITP. Some progress was realized at first, but things began to dip as the term of the first chairperson of the AU Commission, President Alpha Conare, was ending. In an article in International Affairs, which sought to assess the progress of APSA after its first 10 years, Alex Vines, who had sat in a couple of meetings and also brought some evidence from there, said the initiators of the continental projects, such as the New Partnership for Africa's Development and the African Peer Review Mechanism, among them Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, Abdoulaye Wade of Senegal, and Olusegun Obasanjo of Nigeria, are no longer in office as national presidents, and their successors lack the visionary drive for a Pan-African project. And so, while this was acknowledged in several quarters, it might be said that many of us tend to romanticize the idea of the good old days of that African Union's founding and what happened at the start, and that we tend not to appreciate the good that is being done in front of us today. It might be said that that's the case. So I think it's important to take such observations at face value. But 8 years after this assessment in that Journal of International Affairs, let us really take a critical look at the evidence before us and then ask ourselves very frankly whether this normative framework that was set 2 decades ago, that got all of us so excited, that was full of promise, that the destiny of Africa was about to change for the better, let's see whether it remains intact and whether the architecture that was designed to implement it credibly is still fit for purpose. And in examining the progress made, I want to take a sample of situations. We could take many situations, but in a lecture that is restricted in time, I will focus only on several. And so I would like us to subject them to the test of norm integrity and architectural safety to see what we'll find. So in one of two sets of evidences, let's look at elections and unconstitutional change in government. Let's look at AU's, the African Union's recent handling of elections, which are typically, in any case, seen as the barometer of a country's progress toward democratization. One of the best established norms is the rejection of unconstitutional change of government, particularly through military coups. From a time when military coups were the order of the day, we have come to expect that any takeover of government by the force of arms will be met by suspension of that member state and by sanctions. Invariably, the affected member state is supported over time to return to the Union. And interestingly, thus far, no member state that was suspended by the African Union for reasons of unconstitutional change in government has resigned from the Union. But the more challenging situation, however, is that of the extension of presidential term limits, either through the front door or through the back door. Those who have chosen to extend their stay in power, unfortunately, are rarely sanctioned. We've seen a few exceptions. But the continent is clearly suffering reversal in several aspects when it comes to this norm of unconstitutional change in government. Where the Africa Court of Human and People's Rights makes a judgment that an attempt at a presidential term limit is illegal or unconstitutional, on at least 3 occasions in the last few years, some states have defied the ruling of the African Court. In Côte d'Ivoire, we saw how the Ouattara regime failed to honor the demands or implement the judgment of the African Court. The African Court made similar rulings in Guinea and Benin Republic. The AU had no say in any of this, in a sense. Côte d'Ivoire, of course, has since sought to withdraw from the mandate of the African Court in several ways. I think many of us are following that, and I would not dwell on that. But the action or inaction of the AU Commission has tended to cement a pattern that weakens the integrity of the normative instrument and that undermines the legitimacy of our own African Court. To be clear, the regional economic communities are not without a role in this as well. ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, for example, did not challenge President Alpha Condé in Guinea and President Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire as such. So this underscores the vital importance of the collaboration between the African Union at the center and the RECs, Regional Economic Communities, on the question of implementation of our norms, at least. And I probably should have also said in the first instance that the regional economic communities were from the start seen as part of the building blocks for the success of the African peace and security architecture and the regional mechanisms. But in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, and this is an ominous sign of things to come. The AU Commission proceeded to monitor the elections in Côte d'Ivoire when it could have taken other decisions, including making a statement, for example, that the conditions, the necessary conditions did not exist for elections in a member state, in that member state, and even refusing to deploy election monitors as a result. In the recent case of Chad, following the death of Idris Deby, we are seeing a reversal of even the aspect that the AU has traditionally been better at. So the failure by the African Union to sanction or suspend Chad and impose sanctions when there's a clear takeover by the military, which is the bread and butter now of the African Union. The failure to impose sanctions, if only symbolically, is further confirmation of the reversal of the work of the Union. So while the RECs, Regional Economic Communities, are not necessarily faring better themselves, the ECOWAS Commission has a better record of late in terms of resisting these unconstitutional takeovers through the back door, if you like. For example, under Gbagbo, you saw a refusal to monitor elections in the Gambia with an argument that conditions were not right. And following the most recent coups in Mali, sanctions were imposed, notwithstanding external interest to the contrary. We have not managed to do that in Chad, although the situation in Mali begins to slide to a terrible place with the news that we've picked up today as well. In any case, what must we make of such developments? While the AU Commission has many gaps, the task of suspending a member state or imposing sanctions is not the responsibility of the Commission per se, but that of member states. But the question of the motivation of member states is one that we'll discuss later. That's coming. However, of the AU Commission, any observer would be justified to draw any of the following conclusions. First, that the AU Commission lacks confidence and is thus self-censoring in relation to the powers accorded to it under the African Union protocols, for fear of offending powerful heads of state, even when their actions undermine established AU norms. Second, that the AU Commission is lacking in competence, in part. And third, that there is a clear or deliberate anti-norm behavior within the Commission. I myself don't really think the third is the case. But if anyone listened to what I've just said, it is difficult to know which of the above plausible conclusions is the real issue. That notwithstanding, 20 years after the establishment of the African Union, almost, one must raise concerns about why an AU Commission is not able to play the critical role expected of it. The expected self-confidence of the Commission seems lacking at the moment, and it's important to get to the bottom of it. In sum, Africa does not lack normative instruments. The challenge is with the effective implementation and the sheer absence of sanctions for non-compliance, which means that all of those norms and our own institutions are undermined systematically. When sanctions are effected, they're done selectively. This inconsistency is a challenge with the work of our organizations. The norms of the continental and sub-regional organizations are valid. It is the abject lack of enforcement mechanisms, in addition to leadership gaps, that are the problems which are not easily surmountable. Let me now go to the second set of evidences that I would like to bring to bear. And it has to do with the Ethiopian-Eritrea military offensive against Tigray. The Tigrayan war is instructive, and this case stands out. It is a situation in which all of the threats to the African Union's normative framework come together, completely, or at least almost completing the unraveling of the AU peace architecture. The war, which broke out in November 2020, revealed an alliance between the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea, who has reportedly developed, and I don't have these details up to date. As of the time I followed it up to date several months ago, it had more than 12 divisions in Tigray. And it has been much more ramped up since the outbreak of the war. Eritrean troops have been accused of many atrocities. In effect, if you like, crimes against humanity in Tigray. There is no official count of just how many Tigrayan lives have been lost, but it is estimated that some 5.2 million people need humanitarian assistance in Tigray today. If large-scale relief is not forthcoming, that region of Ethiopia might be plunged into famine in another 3 months. I think we've picked up those reports in recent times. Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers are currently blocking aid to the region. Indeed, for much of the nearly 6-month war, now over 6-month war, I must say, blockage of humanitarian access and communication blackout have been a recurring feature. The scale of devastation against civilians in Tigray is of great concern and has raised questions from the international community outside of Africa. We might be watching with our arms folded the largest humanitarian crisis and disaster unfolding on our continent in a while. I know we've had the situation in Mozambique, and I'll speak peripherally to that later. It is one thing not to act, but it is another to be indifferent when the world tries to help. Thus far, there is no credible or legitimate African institution to deal, even informally, with the international community on the question of the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. And by the way, we also hear very little about the cost of this war to the entire people, for the entire people of Ethiopia and Eritrea too, that have committed so many of their men and women to this war. How many lives have been lost amongst their soldiers? How many body bags have been taken back to Asmara? And how many have been returned to their families in the rest of Ethiopia? Who is counting the costs? In 2021, when the rest of the world is aspiring to be even better developed post-COVID, let's not talk about the claims of ethnic profiling and what the UN has been doing when some of its members in peacekeeping missions have been called away, have been withdrawn from those missions. Let's leave that alone. What's more significant is that we are seeing a crisis of norms. It is a setback for the move from non-intervention to non-indifference. The foundations of APSA are being short-shrifted. The regional organization that could also respond to this, IGAD, is sidelined, and the principle of subsidiarity seems almost non-existent in this regard. In addition, some of the dynamics of the Tigrayan war confirm new threats to Africa. We're seeing a militarization of the Horn. We're also witnessing a renegotiation of the African state, and I'll come to this shortly. The Tigrayan war broke out on the back of a wounded international system. Actors who do not subscribe to the normative instruments, the humanitarian laws, and the conventions, including the AU norms, seem to have gained an upper hand. Non-African powers have done a lot of damage too, with reports that the UAE introduced drones to the conflict with devastating effect. The backing of actors from the Gulf, in short, contributed to the short shrift of AU norms. Who is looking at all of this? But so let's pull back and look at the African peace and security architecture. How could we have applied it? How could it have responded to Tigray? This is an internationalized conflict and not an internal conflict as has been portrayed. Even if an internal conflict, non-interference is not an excuse. It's not an excuse. It is an international conflict. One could ask, therefore, why is AMISOM in Somalia? While this is not about proactively deploying a mission, it is clear that African ownership and leadership is glaringly missing on the question of Tigray. What happened to Article 4H? I ask tongue-in-cheek, though. Not even a statement on it or the threat of invoking it is anywhere on the radar. So there was early warning as well, but no indication that there was an official trigger at any point in time. So the fate of APSA may have been sealed by this conflict in Tigray. In one of my research interviews several weeks ago, preceding this lecture, I captured this statement from one of my respondents, which I want to repeat verbatim to avoid much of it being lost in translation. The African, quote, "The African continent has betrayed the people of Africa when one people or political community," referring to the people of Tigray, feel so betrayed by Africa. They may not have expected that the AU will support or would oppose, but they were expecting the AU to cooperate for establishment of a humanitarian corridor. What happened to the African Union, to the African media? Africa is silent and indifferent. How can a continental organization keep silent in the face of the suffering of the very African people it claims to exist for? The African Union is complicit, unquote. The question must be asked, where is African leadership and ownership, particularly when Africa's representative at the UN imply internationally that Africa would lead? You may have been following some of the conversations in the UN Security Council. There is more to come in Tigray. It seems the war is far from over. If recent reports are correct and the balance is shifting in favor of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the full implications of the Horn must be considered beyond the humanitarian crisis. There can be no doubt that we're seeing a renegotiation of the African state, and the landscape of the Horn of Africa is likely to change profoundly. The nature of the African state is what this conflict is about, let's not forget. This is fundamentally an unfinished ideological conflict between those who seek a centralized unitary system and those who argue for a multinational ethnic federation, period. Whichever way this war ends, we see a domino effect in the Horn of Africa. The AU, or at least the rest of Africa, will be confronted with the question of how to structure the African states. A few decades ago, the leaders of Africa agreed an arrangement to preserve colonially inherited borders. Where are the leaders to lead a new conversation if the current landscape of the Horn faces severe and imminent contestation? Sadly, the militarization of the Horn has already begun, and so this ideological conflict might not be settled without wars of unprecedented proportions, unless African leaders take full cognizance of the evolving situations. As I try to come to a close, the implications of all of this and the role of external actors is something we have to bear in mind. If the silence of African leaders in relation to the humanitarian situation, at least in Tigray, is this deafening, what hope have we that our leaders will respond in their collective, which is the strength of the African Union, to the escalating crisis situations elsewhere, from Mozambique to the Sahel? Perhaps it's already too late. African leaders may have already ceded much of the continent to all forms of external actors with both benign and harmful intentions. The militarization of the Horn of Africa is already in process, if not significantly advanced. So avoiding a situation in which Africa becomes the place where vultures feast certainly requires a kind of collective and strategic leadership that is thus far missing. The geopolitical interests in Africa are not likely to subside anytime soon. Look at the strategic location of the Horn, the abundant natural resources on the continent and rurals, the concerns around terrorism and migration by a young continent. These are all tied to external military presence in Africa. All powers in the world are using hybrid warfare, including the use of private military companies and so on. So, there's enormous international attention to Africa. But it is not only the traditional colonial forces like France that are present in Africa. There are also now third-level forces that are building bases in Africa. We can look from Qataris to Emiratis, and so on. Russia is present. Everyone is present. And a number of leaders and governments have already outsourced their own security to external forces. In my own country of origin, Nigeria, our president was compelled by the situation of growing insecurity to ask for the Africa Command and also France to help deal with insurgency groups. And this is coming from a country which prided itself as the keeper of peace in the region, the only one that could stand up to France 2 decades ago. So what are we to make of our continental peace agenda? One of the key weaknesses is that the AU has not been able to build the relationship with the RECs. The tension between center and periphery has never been resolved. Question of subsidiarity or subordination. Interestingly, in contrast, for the first time on peace and security, the AU is now financing most of its political offices across the continent. This is a good trend. The Peace Fund has secured more than half of the 400 million US dollars to start to begin to work. But you wonder whether this is a little too late. It's an irony that this progress is being made, is being realized when the political leadership finds it difficult to address difficult crises. So overall, the AU peace architecture is not only facing a problem of implementation and leadership, it is also not dynamic in response to new threats. The AU is neither living up to the expectation in relation to new threats, nor is it able to deal with the impact of a wounded international system, part of which is manifested in the monetized approach, for example, of the Gulf states. These flaws cannot be overcome if there's no rethink of the leadership infrastructure. Looking back, the effectiveness of ECOWAS, African Union, SADC, and so on at the start was related to the level of internal pressure on bad governance led by civil society just a couple of decades ago. But we have seen a gradual cooptation of the people's power. The substance has been hollowed out in many contexts, with the leadership of civil society organizations co-opted or decapitated. The relationship between people and continental leaders that we saw in the 2000s have all but disappeared. And this was what our regional organizations and continental organizations connected to at the time. On more than 1 dozen occasions, you saw how the African Union deployed sanctions. As I conclude, I want to talk about where we have seen a flicker of hope in recent times. It's been from ordinary Africans rising up for the sake of their own fundamental freedoms, for the pursuit of their aspirations to live well and to live long. The mass movements, people's protests in Tunisia, Egypt, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Niger, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Nigeria, of recent, with the NSAS movement, and of course, Sudan. All of these speak to the commitment and dedication of the people of Africa to take their destinies in their own hands. Sudan, therefore, is one that we need to look at very carefully. When sanctions failed, and the ICC was contested by African leaders, but African leaders failed to empower their own justice mechanism. So the people of Sudan stood up, took to the streets, and against all odds, those mass movements were not discounted in the end. It offers a good example, but with a caveat that although former President Bashir was removed, the military structures are still intact. Let's learn from Egypt. There are other experiences to learn from, whereby transitions remain militarized and the civil society valve cannot be shut. Citizens in such contexts cannot yet sleep with both eyes closed. One eye must be open and watchful. So we seem to have come full circle. We seem to come full circle every generation. Beneficiaries of the mass movements and even liberation movements have sometimes ended up on the other side of the very ideas and people that they supported. And they do not always remember where they have come from. Another generation now is facing their old heroes. So where is Africa going? How can we reverse this trend and rebuild a better regional and continental architecture? Recalling President Thabo Mbeki's speech at the United Nations University more than 2 decades ago, I quote, "Necessarily, the African Renaissance, in all its parts, can only succeed if its aims and objectives are defined by the Africans themselves, if its programs are designed by ourselves, and if we take responsibility for the success or failure of our policies," unquote. It is an important first step that Africa's leaders take responsibility collectively. They must, and that they commit to retaking ownership of Africa's security and development agenda. The missing pillar of the leadership infrastructure must be brought back. are made stronger than ever. This software, as I said earlier, contains the lifeblood of leadership, and it is based on the relationship between leaders and the rest of society. The experience of the last 2 decades tell us that we cannot just rely on a hollow leadership hardware. If there's commitment to the African peace agenda and to rebuilding a supporting continental peace architecture, every effort must be made to build a strong relationship. So I therefore dream of a Peace and Security Council that has non-state individuals that represent the voice of conscience of those member states. I dream of a people's participation in the election of the members of their commission, not least the chairperson of the commission. It shouldn't be the case at any point in time that we do not have a pool of leaders from across our society and government competing to lead the African Union's Commission. I really look forward to the competency and commitment of those who will lead the Commission, and that this will be tested every time. I look forward to seeing the African Parliament empowered to engage office holders and people across the continent. Ultimately, the question might even be asked whether a group of states that are committed to the rebuilding of the continental peace agenda might start on a clean slate and set the standards by which others join. In short, a new form of peer review for continental peace. Today's Africa Day is a moment of stock-taking, a moment to revisit our common vision and the blueprint for the collective pursuit of prosperity, peace, and the development of African peoples. In doing so, it has been necessary to unearth the painful reality of these times, but it is vitally important to look forward to the possibilities that the future holds if we commit to working together to rebuilding our continent for the common future of Africa's peoples. I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Olonisakin, for your very thought-provoking and insightful lecture. In particular, thank you for your critique of the African Union and its role in some of the challenges that continue confronting us as a continent, and in particular some of the countries that you referred to and the challenges that are confronting them as well. And now we're just going to take a moment and show a brief video, and we'll come back and engage further with you, Prof.
I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land. My body has frozen in our frosts and in our latter-day snows. It has thawed in the warmth of our sunshine and melted in the heat of the midday sun. The crack and the rumble of the summer thunders, lashed by startling lightning, have been a cause both of trembling and of hope. The fragrances of nature have been as pleasant to us as the sight of the wild blooms of the citizens of the veld. The dramatic shapes of the Drakensberg, the soil-colored waters of the Likwa, Iqeli, Lotugel, and the sands of the Kalahari have all been panels of the set on the natural stage on which we act out the foolish deeds of the theater of the day. At times, and in fear, I have wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena, the black mamba, and the pestilential mosquito. A human presence among all of these, a feature on the face of our native land just defined, I know that none dare challenge me when I say I am an African. I am the grandchild of the warrior men and women that incense Kukuni land. Patriots that Tetwayo and Mpepu took to battle. The soldiers Mushweshwe and Ngumunyane taught never to dishonor the cause of freedom. I am the child of Nongause. I am he who made it possible to trade in the world markets in diamonds, in gold, in the same food, for which our stomachs yearn. Being part of all of these people, and in the knowledge that none dares contest that assertion, I shall claim that I'm an African. Today, it feels good to be an African.
And now I shall take this opportunity to pose some questions to you, Prof. These are questions that have been raised by some of our distinguished guests. And the first question is from Disetso Manoki. And Prof, I shall take 2 questions at a time, just so that I do not overwhelm you and give you the opportunity to respond. The first one is from Disetso Manoki, and the question is, has African Union lost its ability to intervene in states where guns are blazing in the African continent, and also in silencing the guns? And the second question is from Protesius Ndawendapo. And the question is, Africa's biggest problem is leadership. How can we ensure that the best people-centered, genuine, incorruptible, and action-centered leaders or action-oriented leaders are identified, groomed, and developed for both public and private sectors? Prof?
Do you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Prof. Go ahead.
Right. No, thank you so much. Excellent questions. Has the AU lost its ability to intervene in states where the guns are blazing? I would say yes and no. I don't want to be typically academic about it, but the no has to do with the template that we have. But we have departed from that template, and the leadership question is the reason why we have lost that ability to intervene. That leadership question is front and center of it, because unless we have leaders whose, if you like, whose agendas are disconnected to the agenda of the African peoples, they ought to be able to stand up to anyone, speaking on behalf of the African people, to intervene without fear, without any kind of fear. And we're not seeing that at the moment, because we see leaders who sit in the spaces. And I know that I'm generalizing so very terribly, but the fact that we have only few exceptions to this rule, sometimes it makes the point. Those leaders who actually only respond to the interests of their own and their networks and their external partners, who connive ultimately with them to really destroy the future of Africa. That is the problem that we're dealing with. And of course, you can say that on this same question as well, there's complexity to it. And that complexity lies in the others that are present in Africa at any point in time that would normally even challenge the best leaders and the best ideas. And we've never really overcome that as a continent. We have experienced colonization, by other means, notwithstanding the wealth that we have, because we have not really exploited the space, the God-given freedom that we have earned over time to respond meaningfully and collectively to those external threats. So I fear that things seem dire at the moment, but it shouldn't be so if we had even a critical mass of leaders that can go back to those normative instruments and begin to challenge the occupiers of this space and deal with spaces where the guns are blaring. Those guns are blaring because of the inadequacy of our response, because we closed our eyes and we abdicated our responsibilities. And that's related to the second question, which in a sense I've answered a little bit. I agree there's a leadership challenge and a leadership gap. People-centered leaders, I must say as well that if we're not going to keep having cyclical patterns in which we keep returning to this place every generation, I suspect we will find in the next few years again emergent leaders who will occupy the space from all walks of life and speak truth to power. But it takes time to spend all this time every generation trying to find such leaders. So I think we need two interconnected things all the time. We need to first and foremost apply intellectual leadership. And that's what the Thabo Mbeki School was projecting in one of those videos. And define for ourselves our own problems. The African Renaissance question is a no-brainer if we are the ones defining the problems for ourselves within the context of Africa. And we're not building Africa as it ought to be, but we're responding to Africa empirically. That therefore means that we have to challenge and throw out those theories from outside, the handed down ideas that are irrelevant to the context of Africa, and begin to build. It requires intellectual power, and that power with the theorizing from an African empirical basis that we must take with us to challenge that space. Part of it, therefore, means that we have to be ready to accept that leaders and leadership are two different concepts. Because to lead by yourself is not something that you do. You need the exchange of influence with your very society, those affected by the issues, in order to project this different set of ideas that are useful in Africa and might be useful to the world as well, project them in business, in economy, in politics, wherever it is that we are. And so it requires a rethink, honestly, fundamentally, because I think at the moment we're just really singing from hymn books that were handed over to us and not our own hymn books at the moment. That needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And the next question that I have for you is from Khonze Matladi. And Khonze, acknowledging the work that the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs does, she would like to hear from you in what ways, how can the Thabo Mbeki African School help package the work that they're doing for high schools to start orientating the next generation of active citizens and leaders who are critical thinkers at an early stage. And the next question that we have is from Peto Ratau, who would like to know how best can other African countries receive and reintegrate Ethiopians fleeing into neighboring countries?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I love that first question. That's where we have to return to, because by the time we get to UNISA, by the time we're at the TM school, so much has happened in life. We have already bought into all sorts of ideas, or even if we haven't already done it, we have clarity of thought about our relevance to society, about the kinds of leadership we want to offer. If we're able to intellectually respond to issues around us, it means that we have traveled too far before any kind of meaningful intervention or any kind of meaningful work gets done. So going back to basics, by returning with the kind of curricula, so one of the ideas, and I'm glad that I have a relationship with the TM school. If I didn't, I would have found a way to have that relationship anyway. One of the ideas that I've been testing out myself is that we need to return to high school periodically. I've tried to do that, but on a very small scale. It's a project called preparing future leaders. If you start preparing those future leaders in the university, sometimes it's already quite late. And I think we need to start that from earlier on from school. And the curriculum in schools this is a global problem at the moment, but I think especially on the African continent, for a long time, we have been developing curricula, also really influenced by the Western ideas, curricula that are not necessarily fit for the very environment we're in. Because we're not just training, we ought not to be training our young ones just to collect a certificate. We have to already be training them to have a vision of the change they want to make in society, and provide them with avenues to test it out, even from a very young age. It's why certain countries in the world have been more successful than others, because they focus on their societies and the kind of change that they would like to see, and they embed that in the process of education. And so I very much like that proposal, and I think the TM school is well placed to begin to think around a package for high school. Not because, and that package for high school is not because now we want to go as universities into the realm of the high school, but it is important to begin to engage different kinds of relationships and short programs that are formed in partnership with whoever the educators are in those contexts, and that it should become a matter of fact routinely that we do those things. I think the potential is there, is all I will say. How best can other African countries, in terms of assisting the people of Tigray? It is so complex. It is so complex, and that's why it's the greatest challenge that we face in terms of our ability to respond. I chose that deliberately because it's the one that presents us with the greatest headache. There's no way that is opened in terms of access to the people of Tigray at this moment. Some have escaped into Sudan, but the idea that you would block Sudan and then just block those people in. They're only a population of 10 million. Block them in at all costs in order to finish the work. If it was finished in the 1 month that was planned, then you would say, in any case, any death from any war, from any crisis, is always a difficult one. Then you would say, okay, let's open it up and have access. The formula itself, it's one that is very difficult to see. I think it's clear that the African Union, no less, works with some of those global powers that have been talking about humanitarian corridor. The UN Security Council might revisit it, but certainly the US, certainly the European Union, to open a humanitarian corridor is the very least that any society that is at war tries to make happen, in order that we do not. I don't think the essence of this ideological war is to really get rid of 10 million people just like that. Even if we tried, it's not possible. We have seen some very dangerous situations on our continent in the past. So how best to access them? I would say is that every African that voice should be able to speak to these values. Humanitarian access is not something that should be denied any human being for whatever reason that conflict has arisen. Let me leave it at that, because I'm not sure that I am competent enough to answer what is a brilliant question, really.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. And I have more questions for you. The next one is from Nomfane Lokota. And the question is, the reversal of the peace and stability situation in Mali is deeply concerning. Why are we here today in Mali with all the work that has been done? So that is the question. And the next question is from Shabira. And the question is, are we electing relevant African leaders to pursue the Agenda 2063?
Thank you. Mali, honestly, I will try not to give long answers, because it doesn't matter how long my answer is. I may not be able to answer this kind of really deep questions convincingly, appropriately in this period of time. I think the reversal of the peace and stability situation in Mali has a historical theme to it. The kinds of interests that we see in Mali, and you can look at the Sahel and see the situation of the Sahel. They're two competing ideologies there's an external ideology and an external interest. So the ideology that you have to, and actually maybe our leaders have bought into it as well. You can say that of Nigeria, of all these situations across the Sahel, that when your community, any part of your community feels aggrieved, and they feel excluded over the longer term, you can visit all of this historically. The idea that we settle it only by force of arms, by military force. If you're talking about the Tuaregs or you're talking about northern Nigeria, and the fact that the Boko Haram situation actually initially was non-violent and it was a response to underlying conditions of exclusion that we then responded to through the use of force. That ideological bent, only military can be found to what should have been, a societal conversation to achieve peace. It's one that plagues us a lot actually. The other part of it, though, is the external interest in the Sahel. Much of that external interest is to pursue external geopolitical interests. And that's what our militaries are being funded for, to keep our citizens at home so that they don't migrate into Europe, and also to try and abate, if you like, terrorism in a sense. How is that possible if you have not dealt with the underlying conditions? And so I fear that Mali is moving in, cyclical patterns of zero-sum games, to military, to the kinds of responses that are not likely to give a long-lasting solutions unless we collectively agree to desist from those ideological responses. If you have leaders who would receive external funding all the time, just to prevent, their citizens from realizing their God-given freedom. Because they face existential threats, citizens in the Sahel, when they define insecurity for themselves, are not defining it in terms of terror and migration. They're defining it differently. But if our leaders are going to be supported by external forces only to repress those citizens without responding to the existential threats that they face, then there is no immediate solution unless we change the model. So that's why we're here. Thank you for that question. Are we electing leaders that are going to, this is about Agenda 2063. That Agenda 2063, the vision is a great one. It's an excellent one. And those who will challenge it will say, we haven't even dealt with Agenda 2025. But it begins from now. It begins from now for us to be able to elect those sort of leaders. In my talk, I spoke maybe near passionately about elections, because we have seen a lot of reversal. If we're going to be having elections just for the sake of it and anyone can monitor it and just really sign it off, and I'm sorry to say that, I have colleagues at the African Union, ECOWAS, different of our regional institutions that I respect immensely. And I know that for many of them, their hands are tied. But to even monitor an election is already a patronage system. All right? Everyone who wants to monitor and get, some money at that time. So when you have leaders who are chosen to monitor those elections, they do not even necessarily have teams of people they can rely on so meaningfully, because it's just a ticking the box exercise on many occasions. How many elections do we have which have gone really wrong, and yet at the end of the day we sign it off and say on balance it was free and fair? How can we elect leaders meaningfully if we cannot even go through that system, the very barometer to measure our progress? If we can't go through that meaningfully, it requires integrity. In short, we have to be able to the reasons why we're together and what we want to pursue together and how we want to pursue it, including the kind of elections and the kind of selection process we're going to go through, in order to have those sort of leaders that will take us, lead us towards the realization of Agenda 2063. That would be my quick answer to that.
Great. Thank you very much, Prof. And in the interest of time, unfortunately, we don't have more time for more questions. And I agree with you, these have been very brilliant questions indeed. And thank you very much for responding to them. But I would just like to take a moment to give you this opportunity to give some closing or final remarks that you would like to leave us with.
Oh, wow. I didn't see that coming, so I'm going to speak off the cuff anyway. I think there are 2 points I'd like to make. The privilege of being able to do this on Africa Day, it's a great privilege for all of us to come together and talk about the situation of Africa. And I know that there are many events we organize on May 25th in different ways, but that President Mbeki has given this kind of platform for us to have a frank conversation about the state of the continent is something to behold. And I think it's a real privilege to do that. The second thing I want to say is that, so after Africa Day, what next? And this is where I think that, that's why that's why Timali existed. That's why this TM school exists, to be able to, and of course, no question, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, to be able to help us take things that emerge from here seamlessly. I mean, today we've done, it's not a laundry list, but in a sense, we're saying the state of the continent is not what it ought to be as far as peace and security is concerned. We need an avenue to have these conversations without the fear of contradiction, and to support our colleagues and comrades that are in different places who might be witch hunted if they say anything that goes against what the powers of the day think. It's a major issue. And so to have a place, a locus where we can have these kinds of conversations with utmost freedom, but care as well, so that we can meaningfully take things towards the next step and not come back here next year to say we still have exactly the same problem as we had the year before. I think that is something to really reflect on. And I'm really grateful that this kind of platform exists. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much once again, Prof. And you gave us exactly that, an overview of the state of the continent. And we would like to thank you once again, Prof. And now, ladies and gentlemen, as you logged in earlier to join us for this event, you would have seen a video about the Thabo Mbeki Presidential Library. The library is the first of its kind on the African continent, and it serves as a vehicle through which President Mbeki's legacy will be bequeathed to current and future generations. The library was conceptualized after the realization that both official and private papers of political leaders in African countries are often not preserved or archived properly by their governments. In many instances, if not always, institutions outside the African continent claim and retain the ownership and control of this material, thus denying Africans the opportunity to retain institutional knowledge about their own countries and the continent's leaders. The library aims to serve as a center of excellence in African knowledge, a place for African scholarship, and an interactive space for reflection. And now, it gives me great pleasure to invite the patron of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and Chancellor of the University of South Africa, His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki, to give us closing remarks. His Excellency, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor Sahalo, the chairperson. I'm very reluctant to do what you have asked, to give these closing remarks, because of this outstanding lecture that to which we have just listened. Really, truly, an outstanding lecture. And so I want to say thank you very much to the lecturer. For me, you've outdone yourself. I really am very, very moved by the honesty of your presentation, the frankness, the understanding, a proper understanding of the challenges facing our continent, and the perspective you've given, that whatever our reverses, there is still hope for the future of our continent. As I say, I'm really quite reluctant to intervene, to give these closing remarks, because I don't want to spoil this excellent material that has been put into our hands. Because indeed, as Funmi has just said, we have to answer the question in the end. After the Africa Day lecture, what next? But let me tell you something, relate a story that all of us remember, all of us know. You remember that in the year 2011, that's 10 years ago, the UN Security Council approved a resolution, I think it was resolution 1973. That's a resolution which was then used in order to mobilize the NATO forces to invade Libya, in reality to destroy the Libyan state. That's when Gaddafi got killed. And we have the crisis in Libya, which continues to this day. A week before the adoption of that resolution by the UN Security Council, the African Union Peace and Security Council had actually taken a decision on Libya. And an essential part of that decision of the African Union was that there was no need to use any force in Libya in order to solve the challenge that existed at the time. And fundamentally, the reason the African Union Peace and Security Council decision took that decision then was because it had engaged the various players in Libya, including Colonel Gaddafi, to say, the conflict has started, we have to resolve it, indeed within the norms that Funmi has just been talking about. Gaddafi had agreed, everybody had agreed. And that is why the Peace and Security Council of the African Union took the position that it took, that it was perfectly possible for the African continent to work with the Libyans, all of them, and to resolve the matter of that conflict in Libya peacefully. A week later, the Security Council took exactly the opposite decision. And that decision was based on a lie. And the lie was that the Libyan forces commanded by Colonel Gaddafi were marching towards Benghazi, and in Benghazi they would engage in a slaughter of the civilians. And therefore it was imperative that all of these countries in the world should intervene, having this responsibility to protect. And therefore it was important for them to intervene. There was no such thing. The Gaddafi knows there was no such intention. And indeed it had not happened that the Libyan armed forces had engaged in the massacre of civilians. But we had, as usual, 3 non-permanent member states, members of the Security Council from Africa. South Africa was one of them, Nigeria was another, and I think Gabon was a third. And all 3 voted for that resolution to intervene in Libya on the excuse that this was being done in order to protect civilians. You remember that not too long after that invasion started, the President of the United States, Obama, Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, and President Sarkozy in France, they penned a joint letter or article, which was published in a number of newspapers, in which they said there must be regime change in Libya, that there can't be the peace or the protection of civilians that was wanted without regime change. And indeed, they went and did that. Now, in the course of that conflict, the African Union, as part of the resolution of that conflict, the African Union, would recall, had constituted a team, I think, of 5 African heads of state and government to go to Libya, led by the president of Mauritania, to go into Libya, to engage with the Libyans, indeed to implement this peace process, which the Peace and Security Council had spoken about. That delegation could not go fly into Libya to do that, because really, in essence, the message that came from the NATO forces was that we will shoot your planes down. So that delegation of African heads of state could not go to Libya, this African country, to help to resolve that problem peacefully. And the UN Security Council, NATO, were very, very careful to define Libya as not as an African country. And hence, what they said, that we have consulted the Arab League. The League of Arab States, and the League of Arab States has agreed with this thing. No reference to the fact that Libya is an African country, and therefore no interaction with the African Union. In the end, what we have is a disaster that occurred. And I think we've seen, Funmi has been talking, for instance, about the situation in the Sahel, in the situation in a country like her own country, Nigeria, with Boko Haram. And you saw the collapse of Libya. For instance, as she has just said correctly, Boko Haram did not start as an armed group, but part of the weapons it got and part of the money, the cash that it got, it came out of Libya when Libya collapsed. And a lot of that also affects the rest of the Sahel, affects the Sahel. So I'm saying that you had all of these consequences as a result of the collapse of Libya, as a result of a decision that was taken by the Security Council, contrary to positions that the African Union had taken. In the end, I'm telling all of this long story, which I'm sure all of us would remember, to say at the end of it all, as a continent, we did not sit down to say what went wrong. Why was it that despite the fact of a very correct decision by the African Union about how to resolve the issue of Libya, our 3 representatives on the Security Council voted against that position? How was it that there was such boldness on behalf of the members of the Security Council that they could just ignore and set aside the decision taken by the African Union about an African country and act the way they did? There was no African review, no African assessment of this. But I'm citing this particular instance because I think it illustrated exactly these challenges which our lecturer has been talking about. The absence of the necessary will and capacity, intention, whatever you need, for the African continent to stand up and to say, we will make sure that this African problem is resolved by us Africans. I'm saying there was no attempt to review all of that so that we as Africans can then say, let us correct what went wrong If we showed weakness here and weakness there, let us strengthen ourselves in those areas in order to make sure that, yes, indeed, we remain as people who must determine the destiny of our continent. That assessment didn't take place. And I think it's an illustration, it was a warning about what was to come and a confirmation of what had been happening. The things that our lecturer has been talking about, relating to leadership, relating to the functioning of the African Union, relating to all of these matters. So we have, I think, that challenge to do that review is important. It remains with us. That's why I was saying I'm very reluctant to speak after Funmi has just spoken, because I think what she has said has provided exactly the basis for the review I'm talking about. She has drawn attention to all of the critical matters which have got to do with what is it that we need to do, what are the questions we need to pose, what sorts of answers do we need, what kinds of actions do we need in order to make sure that we continue to define our destiny, to define our future, and refuse to allow that there are other people who are going to come from outside of the continent and pick on this country and say, no, this country will deal with it ourselves, we'll sort it out without you, the Africans. I'm saying that the lecture that we've been given provides us with a basis to engage in that conversation. And I think that she has drawn attention to a very, very critically important part in terms of the future that we need, which is the organization of the masses of the African people. The organization and activation of the masses of the people so that they intervene to determine their own destiny. Not to delegate this matter, to say we are delegating this matter to our leaders. It's them who must meet and sit and determine our future. Because I think we've seen the consequences of that. These negative things that are being talked about. When you look at the suffering, immense suffering that is taking place, whether it's in the Sahel, in Tigray, in Somalia, in South Sudan today, still today, after all of this conflict over a number of years. When you look at all of that, it's clear that a very important intervention that is needed in order to help to sort out these challenges is the involvement of the masses of the African people. And that is a principal challenge. What is it that we must do? To follow the examples that she gave. The engagement of masses of people in the Sudan, in Burkina Faso, in all sorts of countries, is to demand the kind of change that Africa needs. I think that's a principal focus. And I think in that context, an assessment of the political formations on the continent becomes important. What are they? What are they for? Do they relate to the people? Are they playing their role? If they say we represent the people of our country, of our continent, do they in reality represent our people and our continent? Because I'm saying this critical matter of the mobilization of the masses of the people to determine the future of our continent becomes a critical matter, as our lecturer has just indicated. So in the end, Chairperson, I'm saying, we do indeed need to, in the answer to the question that the lecturer has posed, after the Africa Day lecture, what next? I think what next is the kind of reflection that she was doing. That all of us try to use this extraordinary lecture that she has given to engage this reflection on the continent so that we're able to answer the question, at least to pose it, what is to be done? And hopefully to find the correct answers to that question. So I do not think in terms of what is happening with regard to the continent and the directions in which we move, I don't think there's much we can add to what Professor Olunisaki has just said. But I think as a foundation and as UNISA and as the TM school, I think we need to make a commitment that we're not going to say an excellent lecture was delivered and that's the end. To say, but we commit ourselves to use that lecture as an instrument to mobilize in the directions in which the lecturer has intervened. But really, I want to say thanks a lot to her for this excellent intervention. And it's a challenge to all of us. Therefore, not to say we were there, we listened. We gave a standing ovation, but to say we have acted in response to the message, very, very important messages which you gave us. But thank you very much, Chairperson. Thanks to you. Thanks indeed to the lecturer, and thanks to everybody who has participated in this very, very important virtual lecture on Africa Day. And a happy Africa Day, if it's possible, a happy Africa Day to everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you indeed, His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki. Thank you very much for your remarks. I've been looking at some of the comments that have been coming in, and many of them echo your sentiments of the need to not be complacent. I'm seeing some of the comments talking about, indeed, we need to take the destiny into our own hands. So if we want to see change in the African continent with all the challenges that are confronting us, it is up to us, and not just relying on the leadership, but also the masses and the role that they play as well. So thank you very much, His Excellency. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to call one of the advisory council members of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation Board, Professor Bani Pityana, to make announcements and to give the vote of thanks. Over to you, Professor Pityana.
Good evening, good afternoon, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Mine is to thank you all for participating and for sharing this momentous event with us. I just wish it to be known that this is the first time that we've had a virtual Thabo Mbeki annual Africa Day lecture. Last year, we did not have the lecture because of the COVID restrictions that were upon us. And I'm so glad that this year we found the means to gather such an august gathering and such wonderful speakers to join us together to begin this reflection that is so important on Africa Day. A very special word of thanks to the partnership between the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa, UNISA. Special thanks to the patron, President Thabo Mbeki, the chairperson, Dr. Brigelia Bam, and the Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Max Bokwana. In partnership with the University of South Africa, it's wonderful that the members of the Council of the University of South Africa are here represented, I understand, by the Deputy Chair of Council, as well as the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Africa. This is her inaugural Africa Day lecture, Professor Puleng Lenka Pula. And the partnership between Thabo Mbeki Foundation is indeed that which has brought into being the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs. The second thing I want to do is a special word of thanks to the speakers and the participants. But first, the participants, I noticed that gratefully, quite a fair number of members of the executive of the South African government and members of parliament are participating with us. We do not take that interest lightly, because we believe that it is very, very important that South Africa claims its place in African affairs, to be visible, to put its head, shoulder on the wheel for the transformation of the African continent. And we're delighted that so much interest has been shown, and we hope that it will be possible to continue these conversations and what comes after them as well. The speakers, particularly Professor Funmi Olonishakin, who is our special guest speaker today. Wonderful, Professor Funmi, to be with us. Professor Funmi has had a relation with what is now the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs and other institutions in Africa, particularly worthy public guest speaker that we have today. Thank you very much, Professor Funmi, for journeying with us and taking us on this wonderful journey, recognizing the system of norms that have been established in Africa, recognizing the work of the pioneers like President Thabo Mbeki, President Obasanjo, President Wade, all of them who came together at a time, something that led to so many of that hardware that you were talking about, including the Constitutive Act of the African Union. And indeed, we need to recognize that all is not lost with Africa, because the systems remain in place. Professor Olonishakin has taken us on that journey to see what those systems are, and has helped us to really look on the screen to really find out where it has failed. Largely leadership, largely the lack of political will, largely interference from external forces and external interests. And yet, it is important to recognize that she did not leave us without hope. She enabled us to understand that by and large, the hope for Africa is in Africa's own people, the civil society, the ordinary people of Africa, who hold governments to account. And she cited various examples in recent times. Very often we come here every year to take stock of Africa. We can so easily go away very flat and confused about how we can make a way forward. But Professor Funmi today did not leave us without hope. We should thank Professor Sibusiso Vilnkomo, the Executive Director of the Thabo Mbeki School. Also thank Professor Puleng Lenkabula for the partnership that brought this school into being. This too is the inaugural Africa Day lecture for Professor Vilnkomo and for the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs. It's been a wonderful creative event, and that has made it possible for us to hold this event virtually. Thank you, President Thabo Mbeki, once again for being the pillar of this event, the pillar of enabling us to think and reflect about Africa in a manner that will enable us to recognize our agency, to be transforming minds for the African continent. None of this would have been possible without the enormous sponsorship and support that the Thabo Mbeki Foundation wishes to acknowledge today. A full event would not have been possible. Everything from UNISA and the Thabo Mbeki School, SADET and TMPL, Thabo Mbeki Presidential Library, Anglo-American Corporation, the Mutsipe Foundation, the Talis Holdings, Safika Holdings, WIP Investments, Stain City, Total International, Sianda Resources, the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture of the South African government, and the Minister, Mr. Natim Tetwa, Warwick Estates, the Houghton Hotel, the Batung Investments, the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, and the La Caixa Foundation and Telefonica Foundation for Telecom South Africa and BCX. All of them have made the work of the foundation possible, the enormous spread of activities that we're so proud of, indeed including this lecture that we have today. In particular today, we wish to thank those who are behind the scenes and make this event possible, the technical and the administrative staff, the dome and the technicians, the staff at the Thabo Mbeki Foundations and at UNISA, who worked together to put this out for us all today. I wouldn't serve you well if I didn't highlight the amazing direction and leadership of Professor Puleng Sekgalo, who directed us this evening with amazing expertise and very relaxed about this. But all of us, through her and the guest speaker, are very privileged and informed with new knowledge today. And we go away armed to try to see what it is that we need to do in the future. I think President Mbeki said it correctly, and Professor Funmi also did. What next? In these lectures, we've tried always not to make this a one-day wonder. We've tried at times to provoke engagement and discussion, research and writing at one level through the academic work of, in this case, the TM School, the University of South Africa, but also we've tried to spread the tentacles to other universities in the Gauteng area. All of us are being engaged to really engage with these issues and to recognize the importance of them and how it is that we must engage in continual engagement and talking and planning and reflection. So this one day is never a one day as such. It is a day that is the first among many. And we must continue this reflection, this provocation that these lectures give to us to make a wonderful thing out of this continent of Africa that we believe in and that we truly love. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pityana, and thank you to all our viewers on all our platforms and social media. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our 11th Thabo Mbeki Africa Lecture. Have a good evening.
I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land. My body has frozen in our frosts and in our latter-day snows. It has thawed in the warmth of our sunshine and melted in the heat of the midday sun. The crack and the rumble of the summer thunders, lashed by startling lightning, have been a cause both of trembling and of hope. The fragrances of nature have been as pleasant to us as the sight of the wild blooms of the citizens of the veld. The dramatic shapes of the Drakensberg, the soil-colored waters of the Likwa, Iqeli, Notugel, and the sands of the Kalahari have all been panels of the set on the natural stage on which we act out the foolish deeds of the theater of the day. At times, and in fear, I have wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena, the black mamba, and the pestilential mosquito. A human presence among all of these, a feature on the face of our native land just defined, I know that none dare challenge me when I say I am an African. I am the grandchild of the warrior men and women that incense Kukuni land. Patriots that Tetwayo and Mpepu took to battle. The soldiers Mushweshwe and Ngumunyane taught never to dishonor the cause of freedom. I am the child of Nongause. I am he who made it possible to trade in the world markets in diamonds, in gold, in the same food for which our stomachs yearn. Being part of all of these people, and in the knowledge that none dares contest that assertion, I shall claim that I'm an African. Today, it feels good to be an African.